Down East Texas, and I grew up on.
Hello, YouTubers and fellow hams. Well, I kind of got my voice back. I know it's been a little while since the last video. I've been sick for over a week. I had a sinus infection come on that just flattened me for quite a while. But I'm finally getting over it, getting much better now. My sinus headache's gone, I can breathe. Just got to get my voice back, and that'll take just another couple of days or so. So things are looking up. And yesterday, when I started to really feel better, I got some energy, and I went to work. The Spiderbeam's mast is up, and it's a monster. So yeah, we'll look at the mast here in a moment. But it's 18 meters tall, which is 60 feet. 60 feet. That's tall. And quite heavy. So I was a little concerned about how I was going to put it up out here in the desert. You know, that's quite a monster to have, you know, just freestanding. So the first thing I had to think about was the base and how I was going to secure it to the ground. Now what I did was I took one of these fence posts, and these are about 6 feet long, crossed angled iron fence posts, like you pick up at a hardware store. And they have a flat paddle sort of shape at the bottom end, and I drove this thing into the ground, about 2.5 feet or so. And I used a natural hammer, as you can see here as I'm pounding away. These hammers are laying around all over the place on the ground just for the taking and use, you know, so they're really convenient. And I drove that sucker down about 2.5 feet into the ground. To really make it strong, and I didn't shoot this, but I should have, I used desert cement. You know how they made adobe bricks in the past with this powdery sort of sandy dirt that's here? You mix it with water, it turns into a mud, and then if it bakes in the sun, it turns into a brick. Well, James does this trick with his mast, and I thought that's a good idea. After sinking that post into the ground, I packed a bunch more sand on top and then poured water over it. And the water just settled that sand down around the base of that fence post, and I packed it down, and I did some more sand and then more, or it's a powdery kind of dusty sand, and more water. And I really packed that down thick. So as that sets up, that's going to be almost like concrete. That fence post is not going to move, and that gives me a nice firm base for the mast. Now let's take a look at the mast. Well, here is this heavy, massive Spiderbeam telescopic fiberglass mast. It's big. It's heavy. Very heavy. Holy cow. This thing is 18 meters, 60 feet. 60 feet when it's deployed. Oh boy. Well, you saw what I've got to anchor the base out there on the outside. That fence post that I've driven into the ground. That's what I'm going to clamp this to. Now, you're saying, Kevin, that's a fiberglass mast. It's kind of thin. If you anchor that against or clamp it to some steel like that fence post, you're going to scratch and score this thing all up and make a mess out of it. Well, I got a solution for that. Here they are. Right there. These are my solution. These are neoprene, polyprene, whatever these are, these rubbery plastic material boots that you would use to seal up pipes with, right? Come with a couple of hose clamps already on them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this, put it on here, figure out how much I got to snip out of here, probably a little bit like that, you know, to where it'll just close around there perfectly. And then this will sit between the post and the mast, you see, and give it a protective, flexible, protective fit. And then the hose clamps are already here, so I'll just, you know, undo these and put them around the fence post and around the mast, and these are what will clamp the mast to that fence post. But 60 feet tall, the fence post itself is not going to hold it, and this comes with the guy kit, which are these nylon sleeves. They got a hole through the middle here, my finger's going through. That goes down over the mast. This one goes up high. And then they've got these loops that you tie your guy wires through. And this one is a little bit bigger. That'll probably fit somewhere around, I don't know, 20 feet up or so. This one will probably be up around the 40-foot mark, I would guess. And then I'll run guy ropes down, which I also bought several of these 50-foot lengths of paracord. And those will be my guy lines. And then the other thing that this has, now this is a telescoping pole, which means that, you know, it's one piece inside of another, each one tapering down, and you pull them up until they're tight. Well, that's not enough really to hold the weight, because this thing's heavy, it's going to have a lot of load on it, and what would happen is that those would eventually release and it would collapse on itself. So this also has a clamp kit. I have a picture on here. Yeah, well, sort of. Which consists of a bunch of hose clamps of different sizes and a bunch of rubber tubing. So you take these clamps apart, you slide on a length of the tubing to rubberize them, you know, so that they don't mar up the fiberglass. There's a picture of one right there completed. And then you put these around the mast at the seam to tighten that grip and tighten these up. This thing's really made to be put up in a pretty much a permanent installation. It's somewhat portable, but it's going to be a lot of work putting it up and taking it down. I'm getting ready to make the clamps. A couple of things that I wanted to point out. One, they've got a note here in the instructions that talk about installing these on the mast, and they point out that people are confused about how these are supposed to be put on. Now, the tube is a smaller tube inside of a bigger tube, right? And a lot of people will put the clamps on the bigger tube thinking that they're squeezing it down harder on the inner tube, and that's, you know, how this is supposed to work. But they point out in the directions that that is wrong. What you want to do with the clamp is you want to put the clamp on the smaller tube where it is inserted into the bigger tube and put it on there to get a grip. And then that keeps that smaller tube from sliding down into the bigger tube. And that's the proper way. If you put these around the bigger tube on the outside and try to squeeze it in tighter, you can actually damage the mast. They point that out here, and so I figured I'd mention it too. Now, assembling these, they have specific measurements here in millimeters. So I'm going to get my metric ruler out, which I've got here somewhere. I'll find it. Yeah, I'll find it. And what we have we've of course got the hose clamps. We've got heat shrink tubing. You can see this is hollow, right? And then we've got a thick, solid rubber band piece. This is a solid piece of rubber. So these are actually two pieces that you put together here. And yeah, okay, so the way this is going to go is the rubber band is going to be on the inside. I have to undo this to really illustrate it, I guess, but the rubber band is going to be on the inside of the clamp like that to, of course, cushion its grip. And then the heat shrink tubing is going to go over the whole assembly to hold it together. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be cutting. They give you a table here to cut the rubber band and the heat shrink tubing to a certain length and then put them together. And they show the rubber band sitting on the back side of the clamp. And the clamp comes off the end of it a little ways. And then the heat shrink goes over the whole thing and shrinks together to make the finished clamp. So I've got to get busy here. I'll show you one or two finished ones after I get them done, but I got to get my ruler and stuff together. And I got to figure out how I'm going to heat shrink this stuff. I don't really have a heat gun. I've got a lighter. That's not going to be enough heat. I got a butane iron that might produce enough heat. We'll see, but we'll figure that out. Yeah, just a quick assembly note on doing these clamps. They are specific lengths, and the lengths correspond to the tube segment that they go on. So the very first clamp, which is the longest, actually goes on tube segment number 2, right? Because it doesn't go on the first one. It doesn't squeeze the sleeve down over the second one. It goes on the second one above where its seam is on the first to keep it from sliding in. So this is actually going on segment number 2. So I'm taking a Sharpie on each of these and I'm marking them. You can just see the 2 on there. And I'm marking them as I go. So I got 2, 3, 4, and this is this 5 or now let's see. Yeah, okay. And this will be 5. I just thought of this when I was already up to number 6, and I thought, well, I should be doing this because you can keep track of them by size, but then you got to measure them, and you might get the wrong one in the wrong spot. So as I'm making them, I'm marking them. Apologies for the cell phone audio, but I needed to do something smooth here. So this is the first finished clamp. The rubber band comes out to the end of the clamp. The heat shrink tubing is over it, and you can just see the rubber band sticking out here at the end. Now I've got to heat shrink this tubing. How am I going to do that? Well, I don't have a heat gun, but I do have a stove. This should work. And the heat shrink on the gas stove worked fine. That's all shrunk up. So already with this one, I've only got that many more to go. So after I built those clamps and got everything ready, I went ahead and started to work on putting the mast up. Now this is definitely a 2-man job. This thing's just huge. And I thought there's 2 possible ways to do this. One would be to, on the ground, extend the mast out, put the clamps on, get everything all together, and then try to raise it like that, walk it up or whatever. But it's just so long and unwieldy that I thought that would just be really difficult to do. So I decided what I was going to do was I was going to first secure the base. Now you can see here in this photo that those rubber boots that I bought and trimmed worked absolutely perfectly. They allowed me to clamp the mast to that fence post and still maintain a gap between the metal and the fragile fiberglass. So it's very firmly mounted against that fence post now, and I put a board down on the ground for it to sit on so it wouldn't get in the dirt. I wouldn't get that dust and dirt up inside there. So that's a good secure base. And then what I did was I got the guy wire sleeves and everything all ready. I got ropes on them. I got my ladder next to the mast there. I got the wire that I was going to run up the side of the mast on the ground next to it, the spool. Got all the tools and everything I was going to need in my pockets, and I went up on the ladder and I just started extending it. I started with the center, the smallest section, taping the wire to it and extending it up. And James ran around with the camera for a little while and just took a bunch of stills while we were doing this. A little bit later, I needed his help, and there weren't as many photographs being taken, but there'll be a few. And as I extended it, I extended the pole up through the guy wire sleeves and everything that had to be on it, and worked above them. And then as I extended the pole up and it got thicker, I was taping the seams up near the top. Now those clamps are going to support the heavier sections of the telescoping part down near the bottom, up to about halfway, maybe 2/3 up. There's a couple of extra clamps I decided not to use because at the very top there's just no weight. All I've got is the wire. So I just taped the seams with black tape, electrical tape, as I was extending it. And then once we got up to where I was getting to the thicker sections and the guy wires were going to be, I started putting on the clamps and we screwed those down. And as I mentioned in the video, those clamps go above the seam. They don't go around the bigger part and squeeze it down. That would damage the mast. The instructions are pretty clear. The clamps go on the narrower section just above the seam to prevent it from sliding down in. And so we installed the clamps as we went. And then as I got past the part where the guy wire sleeve was tight around the mast, we would just let it go up with the mast as we raised it. Now, about a third of the way up, it started to get a little heavy, and James had to help me. I would lift up the sections and snug them up, and then he would hold it while I put the clamp on, and then I would do whatever else I needed to do at that point. Now, about 25 feet, at about the 25-foot section, and it was easy to figure because each section's about 5 or 6 feet, I put a carabiner, and I tied that around and moved it above the clamp, and then I sort of taped the string, the paracord as well, to the mast, just to make sure it's not going to move around or not going to come loose. And I ran another paracord through that carabiner, and that's going to give me a sight at about 25 feet off the ground that I can raise things up into. And in fact, once I got the mast up, the first thing I did was pulled my end-fed wire up through that carabiner so that it would come off the back of the RV and have some nice loft, and then angle down to a support out at the other end of the area that I'm at. So I've got that carabiner there, so I could also do something else like pull up maybe the 40-meter folded dipole if I want to play with it, or another antenna, so I can use the mast as a support for that as well. And then, of course, I was taping the wire down the side of it as I went. Now, I have seen in the past where some people have helically coiled a wire around a telescoping mast in order to get more wire up. But when I tried that myself, I found that the antenna did not tune well. It was very strange in its behavior. And the obvious reason is helically coiling a wire up that mast makes a big inductor. And that's going to make the antenna act all different from what you would expect, strangely. And you might still be able to get it to work, but it's certainly not going to be as straightforward as if it was just a straight wire running up the side. So I always run the wire straight up the side. So we continued on until we had the entire thing extended, and then I had to guy it down. Now there was just a slight breeze that day. I would definitely say you want to put something like this up on a day without wind. It's so huge and so tall that if you had wind to fight, it would just be impossible to get the thing up safely. So it was actually freestanding on that fence post without the guy wires attached perfectly well. It wasn't moving around at all. But I did want to use the guy wires, obviously, because we're in the desert here, and we'll have days with winds of 20, 30, or even 40 mile an hour. And I'm not looking forward to that. It's going to be an interesting experience and test to see how well this thing holds up, and I'll let you know in a future video. Hopefully it doesn't come crashing down. So I had some tent stakes that I was going to use for the guy wires. They're probably not long enough. I think they're like 9 inches. But what I did after I staked them down and tightened them up is I used some of these natural hammers that are laying around. There's quite large ones. And I put them over the top of each stake. And I might put a couple of extra rocks on there as well as the wind starts to pick up, just to give them more strength, so they're not going to get pulled out of the ground. But you would probably, if you don't have the luxury of these rocks laying all over the place, you'd probably want to use some pretty long stakes for your guy wires so you could have some real strength there. I don't know that it's going to have that much wind loading. It's a cylinder, so the air tends to flow around it and not push on it as hard as it would a flatter structure. But it is going to have some wind loading. It is going to move around. And I'll probably shoot some video when we get a good windy day of that thing, and we'll see how stable it is and see if I have to tighten up the guy wires at all. Speaking of that, the way I did the guy wires, I ran the paracord down and through the tent stake, brought it back up, and then I tied a knot onto the downcoming leg, and that allowed me to adjust it by just pushing up on the knot and pulling down on the guy. I could tighten it up, and then when I let go, the knot sort of cinches back. Like here's the guy line coming through. The knot will kind of cinch back against it and hold itself. Now that's not a good permanent solution, but for adjusting it, that made it easy to get things where I wanted them. And then I just took and put a little tape around the paracord there just downstream from the knot so that it won't slip and slide on its own. And then if I need to adjust it in the future, all I've got to do is just unwrap that little bit of tape, pull and adjust the guy where I want it, and then tape it back up. So it makes it real quick and easy to readjust in the future if I need to. And this is a temporary installation. Obviously, if you were putting this up permanently, you would want to do something a little bit stronger and more permanent for those guy wires. But I'm only going to have this up for 2 or 3 months until 4 months? I don't know. February or March is when I'll be leaving this area and taking it down. So it's only up temporarily here. Once I had it up, I had basically a 60-foot vertical wire that I can play with. So what did I do with it? Well, I put a 9-to-1 un at the base, and I played around with counterpoise wire length, and somewhere around 27 foot of counterpoise off the 9-to-1. This is a VNA sweep on the 80-meter band. Now, it's kind of broad, and I think it's broad because of ground loss. Any vertical antenna, you really need a large number of radials underneath it. Later, I added a ground rod, because you definitely want to ground things, and some more radials, and I tweaked and tuned the radials. And I got it down near the bottom end of 80 meters. Here's another VNA sweep, and now you can see that it's sharper like you'd expect from a more efficient antenna. And I've got it down near the bottom of 80 because I'm going to be doing some CW. I'm going to force myself to get back into CW. So it's doing quite well on 80. I did some whisper testing, and this is 80 meters whisper. And as you can see, we got a lot of hits. This was just before sunrise. And then a little bit later in the morning, whisper on 40 meters. And surprisingly, now this is 1/4 of a watt, right? Just 1/4 of a watt. And surprisingly, I was heard in Japan. How about that? And then here's a 20-meter plot as well. So these are all 1/4 of a watt whisper, and it's getting out pretty well. And it's working okay. I mean, it's working really well, actually. I've played around on 80 meters with it at night and had no problem talking to people. But the other thing I did last night, since I had it up in the air, is I got the bucket variometer out. I wanted to see if I could load it up on 630 meters. And here is the SWR plot. Woohoo! Look at that. Right down about 1.7 to 1 or so. Right on 474.5 kilohertz, which is the center of the most active portion of the band. So I could definitely get it loaded up. Now, last night I gave it a shot. I got my 630 meter transmitter out, and I tried to work a few contacts, and I shot some video for you. Okay, sorry for the perhaps a little confusing camera angle here and the cables everywhere, but you know, in this RV, I've got to do what I've got to do. So here's what's going on. This is my 630 meter CW transmitter. I designed and built this a while back, a few years ago, or a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago. It is a 6-watt CW transmitter, uses an Arduino and a SI5351 generator as the VFO, and a power amplifier designed by GW3UEP to give me about 6 watts out. Now for tuning, I do spot tuning. If I hit this spot button, the signal generator turns on the frequency that I'm on and loosely couples to the receiver's output that goes over to the radio that's being used for receive, in this case the FT817. And that's how I tune this to find where I'm going to be. And I'll show you how that works here in a second. So I've got the Yaesu tuned to 474.5 kilohertz, which is the active, really active spot on 630 meters. And if I turn this up, we should hear some JT9 going on right now. Or just noise. No, that's good. Let me show you how the spot tuning works. Now, this is not going to transmit any power. It just turns on the VFO, but not the PA. So the receiver will pick up the signal. So I get this on frequency with the receiver where I want it to be, and now I should be able to transmit. And when I transmit, this grounds the receiver output, but even with the antenna grounded on the Yaesu, there's still enough RF for it to pick it up, so the Yaesu becomes my side tone, or my monitor. And then after that short delay, you heard the relay click back over and it switched the antenna back. So it's working. So, let's try and call CQ and see what happens. The sun has only been down for about 40 minutes, which... Oh, there's some JT9. I hear 2 stations. Do you hear that? So, we're hearing activity. Those guys are running JT9. If I had a transverter, I could run digital modes, but all I've got is the CW transmitter, so we're just gonna call CQ and see what happens. Actually, what I should do is I want to move below their pitch. So I'm not going to be clobbering those guys. Uh-oh. I guess I gotta clean some relay contacts. Sounds like my transmit receive relay didn't switch back over. There's the JT9 activity. So this is probably about how it's gonna go. He can't hear me. He's over in Texas. That's KB5NJD. Kilo Bravo 5, Norway, July, Denmark. J. Ah, come on, brain. Juno, Denmark. Anyway, I'm hearing him from Texas. He is in Duncanville, Texas. I'll have to look that up on the map. I've tried answering him a few times, but he can't hear me. I think I'm going to take a break for a little bit. It's been about a half an hour. Come back and try it again here in another hour or so. So I've got this massive mast up out here in the desert. It's really quite something to see when you step back. Here's a photo. It looks kind of ridiculous. There's a lot of other campers and RVs around here, and the place is beginning to fill up for the winter. And I get some bemused looks from people as they walk by and look up at this gigantic mast next to my RV. I'm hoping it can hold up to the wind, because it's certainly going to be a fun platform to play around with and experiment with. And it's nice to have that carabiner up there so I can pull other antennas up and make use of it as a support for other antenna experiments too. And I'm not sure what I'll be doing with that 60-foot piece of wire sticking straight up in the air. I might use it most often with the 9-to-1 as it's configured. It works really well on 80 meters and 40 meters. And I can tune it with the antenna tuner. I can force it I can force feed it a little bit of signal on 160 meters. But I have yet to try and make a contact on 160. But it's only been up there for a couple of days, so I've got a lot of time to play with it. And you'll probably see it in a future video for certain, and I might talk some more about how it's holding up. It's a very well-made telescoping pole. It's heavy. The walls are really thick on it. It's definitely made for long-term installation. If you wanted to put this thing up in your backyard and just leave it up, with those clamps on it, it's going to stay up, and it's probably going to hold up very well to the elements and to the sun and to the weather. It's just built to do so. I mean, it's not really, I wouldn't say it's built for temporary portable installation as a regular use, just because it's so unwieldy to put up. It's definitely a two-man job. It's not easy. it's a bit of work. I mean, I worked on it pretty much all day. It was probably 3 or 4 hours total of just solid work, you know, not counting the prepping and planning and then the fine tuning and adjusting guys afterwards and playing around with it. It was a full day for me. By the time I was done messing around with this thing, it was 10 o'clock at night, and I realized, hey, I'm just not quite healthy enough yet to be pushing myself this far. I was pretty tired last night. But anyway, thanks again, Don, for sending me this. I'm going to play around with it quite a bit more and hopefully get a lot of use out of it while I'm here for these 3 or 4 months. And then Quartz Fest, I'm going to have a different mast to play with that Terry is sending me. And so we'll look at that one when it arrives. I'll be using it at Quartz Fest in January. But anyway, that's the Spiderbeam's telescoping mast. It's a really high quality piece of kit. If you want to put something up 60 foot tall in your backyard, you could put it up and leave it up. It's definitely built to stay up. And it's a nice high quality telescoping pole. They didn't cheap on it at all. So there you go. Sorry for the late video, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Also, if you're not already a subscriber, click to subscribe. Join us on the Facebook channel for discussion about the videos. And if you'd like to help support this channel, please click to support me on my Patreon page.